Here's the rewritten version in English with the same depth and emotional intensity. I always believed my marriage was strong, not perfect, but solid. Audrey and I had been together for years, navigating the usual ups and downs, always managing to work through our issues, or at least that's what I thought. Looking back now, I realized that while I was holding on to the idea of a secure marriage, Audrey had already checked out. It didn't happen overnight. It was a series of subtle changes. The small, thoughtful gestures stopped, the warmth faded, and the connection we once had slowly unraveled. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Life gets busy, moods shift, but this was different. People don't just wake up one day and start treating their spouse like an afterthought. Change like this doesn't happen without a reason, and I was determined to find out what that reason was. She started coming home late more often, her responses vague whenever I asked where she'd been, just out, barely glancing up from her phone. When I pressed for details, she would roll her eyes, sigh, or act like I was being unreasonable. That was new. Audrey had never dismissed me like that before. She used to share everything down to the smallest details of her day. Now I was lucky to get more than a one-word answer. And then there was her phone. It was always with her. Even when she got up for a glass of water, it never left her hand. Late at night, I would notice the soft glow of the screen. "Who are you texting?" I asked once. "Just a friend," she replied. But when I asked which friend, her tone snapped. "Why do you care?" Lying in bed one night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I turned to her. "Audrey, what's going on? Why are you acting like this?" She exhaled sharply. "If I had something to say, I'd say it. Let me sleep." That response stung. It confirmed the fears I had been pushing away. A few days later, the truth came in the form of a phone call from a friend. His voice was hesitant but direct. "Look, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but you might want to take a closer look at Audrey. I saw her with someone. It didn't look like just friends." I was speechless. My first instinct was denial. No, not Audrey, not my wife. There had to be some mistake. But then I thought about the secrecy, the distance, the late nights, the locked phone, the shift in her attitude, and a chilling realization hit me. This wasn't out of nowhere. I had suspected something was off, but knowing it and proving it were two different things, and I needed proof. Her phone was the key. Audrey had always been protective of it, but lately she had taken it to another level. She kept it on her at all times, even when stepping outside for a moment. She angled the screen away from me whenever she used it. That alone was suspicious, but I needed more than a hunch. Then one night I got my chance. She left her phone on the couch before stepping into the bathroom. My heart pounded as I reached for it. This was it. I swiped up. The screen stayed locked. The password had been changed. I tried the old one anyway. No luck. My stomach dropped. We had never hidden passwords from each other before. This wasn't just about privacy. It was a deliberate wall. She was keeping something from me. If I couldn't get into her phone, I needed another way. I needed to see it with my own eyes. A few days later, the opportunity came. Audrey casually mentioned she was going out to run an errand. No details, no mention of who she was going with. It was vague enough to set off my instincts, so I decided to follow her. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and drove after her, keeping a safe distance. She weaved through the city, eventually pulling up in front of an unfamiliar house. I watched as she stepped out of the car and walked straight to the door, knocking with the ease of someone who had done it before. The door opened. A man I didn't recognize stood there. He wasn't surprised to see her. In fact, he smiled and stepped aside, letting her in. The door shut behind them. I didn't approach. I didn't confront her. I didn't make a scene. I just took pictures. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the house, at the undeniable proof of my marriage falling apart. Then quietly, I started my car and drove home. That night she returned as if nothing had changed, and that was the part that hurt the most. I had waited long enough. I called her into the living room and told her to sit down. She sighed, obviously annoyed, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me like she had better things to do. I took a deep breath, met her gaze, and said calmly, "End this. Whatever this is, or we're done." I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, I just laid it out as fact. She frowned, shaking her head. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, voice flat. "There's nothing going on." I pulled out my phone and turned the screen toward her. The pictures were right there, clear shots of her walking into his house, laughing with him. For just a second, just a split second, she looked caught, then just as quickly her expression changed. The guilt vanished, replaced by something else. Anger. "You followed me," she snapped. "That's insane. You don't trust me, so now you're stalking me. That's sick, Nick." A cold realization washed over me. She wasn't sorry, she wasn't embarrassed, she wasn't even surprised. Instead of owning up to it, she was turning it on me, making me the villain for discovering the truth. I exhaled slowly, nodding to myself. "Okay," I said, standing up. "Got it." I didn't argue. There was no point. She had already made her choice. The next week passed in a fog of silence. We lived under the same roof, but we were strangers now. No conversations, no fake smiles, just two people waiting for something to break. She didn't bother explaining herself. I didn't expect her to, because I already knew she wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to beg her to be faithful. That wasn't love, it was desperation. And I wasn't desperate. So while she pretended like nothing had changed, I was making my own moves. I paid a quiet visit to my attorney. The divorce papers were drawn up and ready, neatly tucked away, waiting for the right moment. But that wasn't the only surprise I had in store, because while Audrey had been sneaking around, I had found someone too, her best friend. What started as shared grievances turned into something deeper. She saw the truth about Audrey for what it was. She understood what I had been dealing with. So if Audrey thought she could play games, she was about to learn a hard lesson. That night, I came home to the smell of home-cooked food, a meal I hadn't had in ages. She set the table, poured the wine, smiled like nothing had changed. Midway through the meal, I placed my fork down and met her gaze. So I asked, "Have you ended your affair?" Not a single flinch. Instead, she smirked, leaning back in her chair. "I'm leaving you." I let out a slow breath, not in pain, but amusement. Once those words would have shattered me, but now they felt like the last page of a book I should have closed long ago. Without a word, I got up, grabbed the divorce papers, and slid them across the table. "Perfect," I said. "I already signed." For the first time that night, her confidence wavered. Then ding dong, her head snapped toward the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. I was. I opened it, and there she was, Audrey's best friend, effortlessly stunning. I stepped aside. "Meet my new girlfriend." Audrey's expression was priceless. "Because when you play games, you better be prepared to lose."